Let's go straight, though, to Joe Twyman, who is, of course, our man with his finger on the pulse when it comes to the polling of this country. Joe, very good morning to you. I think it was only this weekend that we learned that that Rishi Sunak was more popular than Keir Starmer for the first time in his entire sort of political career, which is rather ironic, really, isn't it?
When you look at the broad picture of polling and whether it's the question of who would make the best Prime Minister or simple positive, negative views of each of the party leaders, across most of the polls, Keir Starmer remains the most popular political leader in Britain. But having said that, you also have a situation where Ed Davey is doing quite well, though there's a much larger number of people saying don't know for him, and you have a situation where all of them are doing pretty badly because of the situation that you've mentioned. And so saying that Keir Starmer is doing the best is no great compliment to him, given the performance of all of the leaders.
And I wonder also, I mean, you'll know this better than anybody. I mean, once you're in power, you know, obviously people pay a lot of attention to the polls as they go into an election. I mean, once you're in Prime Minister's as chair in Downing Street, presumably the thing you then do is ignore all the polls because you don't really want to look at them, because what we now know is that whoever is in power is likely to be more unpopular than whoever isn't, if you know what I mean.
Well, yeah, and I think this may, and I do stress may, be part of Keir Starmer's plan. Tony Blair talked a lot about how he paid too much attention to the polls and to the headlines in his first parliament, particularly in the first year after winning an enormous majority in 1997. So, if you were being generous, you would say that Keir Starmer is consciously moving against that, making the tough decisions now, being unpopular in the hope that the situation will recover, and it may well do, because I imagine that most of this actually won't matter. It will be the kind of polling numbers that we see after the conference season and, crucially, after the budget that will really make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely right. And in terms of where Keir Starmer is right now, I mean, he seems to be sort of hunkering down. He was around it last week, obviously, at Labour Party conference, where he sort of continued to try and just bat away any kind of accusation of bribery, any accusation of corruption, any accusation of, you know, at the very least, favouritism for people who were giving him money. He then went to New York, where he spent some time at the UN, making speeches and all of that. That was last Thursday, I think, last time we saw him. We haven't seen him since. So, I mean, the public are starting to ask questions about what he's doing. You know, and I say the public because I talk to the public every day, and they're not that happy with Keir Starmer. So is that, do you think, reflected in the polls, or will that be reflected in the polls perhaps in another week's time?
I imagine that actually that probably won't have a major impact on polling. The reason for that is that so much attention, understandably, is on the Conservative Party conference this week, and so questions being asked of the four Conservative leadership candidates, and that's really something that's dominating the news agenda. And I imagine that if this were to continue into next week, if we didn't see Keir Starmer past the end of the Tory conference, then I think that really would raise questions. But for now, I think he's probably happy to let the Conservatives have the limelight for their week in the sun.
But that's an interesting one as well, isn't it? Because I noticed that on Sunday that, you know, all the sort of big political programmes, while they were still mentioning the Labour Party, and they got mostly Pat McFadden on to talk about the latest accusations, they kind of pivoted away from Labour into the Tory party. And I have to say, an awful lot of people, even though we're getting Tom Tugendhat on later on the show, don't really give a stuff about the Tory party conference, you know, because it doesn't really mean much to them. And people's view of the Tory party is that, you know, they had their chance the last 14 years, they screwed it up at the end. We're not really very interested in what their plan is or what they want to say about fixing the country, because they were partly responsible, if not wholly responsible, for ruining it.
Well, while it may be true for some people, the reality is that these events get covered substantially compared to the normal period of time when each party will be fighting it out. and they will take it in turns, one after the other, to have their week, or well, less than a week, thankfully, few days at conference. And the Labour conference will be covered significantly. There wasn't much talk about the Tory leadership race during the Labour conference, and now most of the machinery of news gathering in this country moves here to Birmingham to the Labour conference. And it all happens. Sorry, for the Conservative conference, and it all happens again. I expect normal service to be resumed certainly by the end of this week. But this is a sort of strange quirk of British politics.
Yeah.
It happens every year, and we just have to, in a sense, put up with it.
Sure. And what about the issues that people worry about? I mean, I don't know if you've done any polling in the last couple of weeks about the issues that people care about. You know, we were always told, and I think certainly during the election, immigration was massive. There's lots of stories around about that this morning. Similarly, the cost of living, the economy, you know, the future of people's jobs, that kind of thing. Have you got anything recent on what issues people are worried about?
Yeah, all of the recent polling shows that the cost of living remains very important. Immigration in certain circumstances has risen, certainly for certain groups. But there's a big distinction between asking someone the most important issue facing the country and the most important issue facing them and their families. And certainly for many people, the most important issue facing them and their families is the cost of living. That is something that remains top of mind, which is why the budget at the end of October will be so important. In fact, you may question why it's taken the Labour government until the end of October to actually have that budget. But nonetheless, that's when it's taking place, and I think that will really mark, if you like, the beginning of things getting serious for the Labour Party, because if they can't come up with a credible alternative, if they can't come up with something in their budget that actually resonates with people, if they lose, and it is a big if, they lose their reputation for economic competence relative to the Conservatives, then that could be a much longer turning point rather than the various talking points that we've had over the last couple of weeks.
Right. Well, let's have a look at what Jeremy Hunt had to say, and this was at the Conservative Party conference yesterday, former Chancellor, of course, addressing the problems that Labour say they've inherited.
And I think one of the biggest lies we've had since Labour came to office is this nonsense about having the worst economic inheritance since the Second World War. Well, you don't have to take my word for it. I mean, just read this week's Economist, where there's an article saying that she could actually have not a black hole of 22 billion, but a surplus of 39 billion to play with in the budget.
So he says that there might be a surplus. I mean, I'm not sure people are buying this £22 billion black hole from the Labour Party, because they keep saying they're going to find money to pay for various public sector pay rises. The teachers only yesterday agreed a 5.5% pay rise. The nurses, of course, have rejected a 5.5% pay rise. They've got plenty of money for that. So what's the truth about it?
Well, the reality is we don't really know, because when it comes to the economy, when it comes to spending, tax revenues, and all that sort of thing, and crucially borrowing, it depends on how you count these things, and that's the really, shall we say, interesting question for all sides. And where you count and how you count determines whether you get this enormous deficit or potentially a surplus. And what we may see during the budget is that the Chancellor Rachel Reeves actually announces an adjustment to the way that we count these things, which gets terribly complicated, which means that suddenly there is money available to spend on things. But it's certainly an interesting messaging question, because up until now we've seen Labour emphasise time and again that the situation is very difficult, and I'm sure we'll hear more of that in the budget, but the situation may change.
Yeah, absolutely right. Joe, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. That's Joe Timon, founder of Delta Poll.